Okay. Good afternoon or good morning, whenever you're watching this. I guess that's up to you. My name is Chris McCarty. I'm with the Knoxville law firm of Lewis Thomason. We also have offices in Nashville, Tennessee, as well as Memphis, Tennessee, and we service the entire state of Tennessee and all types of civil and other needs. So if you ever need anything at all, please let us know. The thing that I'm here to talk to you about today is Tennessee, a wage and hour overview. What I practice at Lewis Thomason is employment law. I represent both public and private employers and all manner of issues and litigation that can arise involving their employees and situations involving employees. And one of the biggest things that we look at it as an area of risk is wage and hour. So what I'm going to do today, because this is a short presentation, it's supposed to hit the really high points of this and sort of get you in and out, is I'm going to give you 5 lessons on Tennessee wage and hour, which also a lot of that really hinges on federal wage and hour issues. So let's just get started. The first one is we always have to think about, when looking at wage and hour, the federal FLSA, which is the Fair Labor Standards Act. All right, and what the FLSA does is basically 3 things, 2 of which I'm going to talk about today. It sets a federal minimum wage, and it also sets up overtime regulations, and it also talks about youth workers or juvenile workers. We're not going to really hit on that today. Hopefully you're not employing a lot of 14-year-olds on a factory line. If you are, you definitely need to call an attorney. Call us at any point. But moving back to it, so let's go to lesson number 1. Always remember, in Tennessee, especially if you're new to this area, the only minimum wage we have, and especially in East Tennessee, is the $7.25 per hour federal minimum wage, which is under the FLSA. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of talk about the federal minimum wage over the last few years, and federal government, Congress, President's office. And one of the things that we do expect at some point in the near future is a change to this. It's been $7.25 for a long time. I know a lot of people talk about $15 an hour, which is what it is in a lot of states and cities across the country. I can't imagine that happening too soon in Tennessee, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a federal modification at some point in the next few years. But as of right now, it's still $7.25, and there's nothing that changes that here in Tennessee. The other thing to think about that people forget is you have to be really careful under the FLSA as to when you make an employee hourly versus salary. And the way we actually call that under the FLSA is exempt versus non-exempt. Are you exempt from overtime regulations, or are you non-exempt from overtime regulations? If you're exempt, you are a salaried worker. If you're non-exempt, then the overtime regulations are going to apply to you. So even though you're exempt, even though you might say to somebody they meet all the duties of being able to have a salary, like maybe they're an administrator that manages people, maybe they're a professional, like a lawyer or an accountant, somebody has a professional degree, maybe they are an executive. There's all kinds of administrative exemptions, what we call the duties test. But even if that person meets all of those qualifications, they still have to have a minimum salary if you're going to pay them a salary rather than hourly. And that minimum salary changed a few years ago, and now it is $684 per week, or a minimum salary in this country for a salaried employee is $35,568 per year. If you have somebody on salary and they're making less than that, you are absolutely violating the Fair Labor Standards Act, unless there are certain exemptions for certain jobs, like lifeguards, like camp counselors. But unless it falls under one of those very specific exemptions, like teachers, then you probably have a big problem, and you need to make sure you're talking to counsel. All right. The next thing is just overtime in general. Lesson number 2. Don't forget that it is always set on 40 hours a week. One example that I see as a mistake that employers make, especially if they're new to this, as maybe they started out as a small company and now they've grown, is they'll do it on an average. And that makes common sense, but common sense doesn't always apply to the law, especially federal law. Okay? So even if you're paying your employees every 2 weeks, you cannot average out that time to make sure that they're on average less than 40. The only thing the FLSA looks at is per week. So let's just say hypothetically over a 2-week period, in week 1, you have an employee that works 20 hours. Obviously, they don't qualify for overtime. You pay them their hourly for 20, right? Let's say in week 2, they work 60 hours. Now, over the average of that, that's just 40 hours. But you owe 20 hours of overtime because in that week 2, which is the only one that matters, it's week by week, they work 20 hours in excess of 40. The other thing you have to do is you have to set your standard week. and you have to use that same standard week for all of your employees. So for example, if you decide that your week is going to be Saturday at midnight until 7 days later, that's fine. If you want to start Monday at 6 a.m. until 7 days later, that's fine. You cannot pick and choose between employees though. So whatever your company's standard week is, that's your standard week period, and that's how you calculate overtime. So anytime within your standard week that you set that somebody goes over 40 hours, you owe them for overtime at time and a half for every amount of time over it. And I got to say this, got to pay it. I can't tell you how bad the penalties are for the FLSA. You're talking about sometimes double or triple. You're talking about 2 to 3 years worth, and sometimes it can be multipliers of multiple employees. It can be hundreds of thousands of dollars before you blink an eye. And the other thing about it that you might say, well, nobody's going to sue me. The employee doesn't have to sue you. We have a federal Department of Labor office in Knoxville, downtown Knoxville, that's been there forever. There are full-time Department of Labor investigators that the only thing they do is if an employee, any employee, makes a complaint to that office that they're not getting treated correctly under federal labor law, they'll investigate it for free, they'll apply the fines for free, and that's who you're dealing with. It's not a lawsuit, it's a federal investigator. So make sure you pay it. The other thing that I'll throw in just real quick, unless you're a public employer, if you've heard, oh, well, instead of paying time and a half, I can do this thing called comp time. And comp time's an interesting concept. It's basically this. It's for every hour you work over 40 overtime, right? So every hour over 40 in a week, if comp time applies to you, you can give that person 1.5 times hours off, so PTO or vacation time. There is no such thing as comp time for a private employer. There is no such thing. It is for public employers only. If you're doing comp time and you're a private employer, you've got a problem. Lesson number 4, mandatory breaks. This is the Tennessee law. So in Tennessee, under our labor guidelines, every 6 consecutive hours worked, employees have to have at least a 30-minute break. It doesn't have to be a meal break. It doesn't have to be at a meal time. It can be, which is fine. And it's not required to be paid. If you want to pay it, that's up to you. That's a perk of the job. But it's an unpaid 30-minute break after every 6 hours of consecutive work. One thing you don't have to do, and you see the second slide there, if it's a job that is automatically going to have a lot of downtime, the most common example that the Tennessee Department of Labor gives is a nighttime security guard, where I'm not saying it's not hard and it's not important, but there's a lot of sitting around. Okay, so if it's one of those jobs, I used to work when I was growing up, because I grew up in Superior County, at a laser tag place, and I only worked every 20 minutes, over and over again, so lots of downtime. If you have a job like that, you have questions about it, call the Tennessee Department of Labor, run it by them, and determine, is this the type of job where we don't have to provide breaks? Give them your reasoning, and you a lot of times can get an opinion. Lastly, frequency of pay. Tennessee's a little different on this. A lot of people believe that there's a federal standard for how often companies or employers have to pay you. There's not. It is really state by state. And in Tennessee, a few years ago, we changed our law. So now the minimum standard is, in this state, you have to be paid at least every month. At least every month. Now, most employers are going to do 2 times a month, so on a 15th or a 30th, or they're going to do biweekly. And that's the standard. And I would say if you're doing that, don't change it, because your employees probably like getting paid every few weeks. But I'm telling you, the minimum standard in Tennessee is you can pay people at least once per month. And that concludes our presentation today. I told you it was going to be a quick one. The goal of it is to hit the high points, tell you the biggest risk areas that I see. If you ever have more complicated questions or issues that arise, if you get called by the Department of Labor, please make sure you're not just handling that yourself. Call an attorney. We have people in our office that can handle that. We'd be more than happy to help. And good luck, and please hope you never have to call me, because you never have any issues.